Hey, welcome back to Deep Dive Movie Reviews. I'm Steve Hackman along with my friend James Marsh. James, what are we going to be looking at today?
Today's show, we're looking at Mike Flanagan's Netflix miniseries, Midnight Mass. This is the story of an isolated New England community called Crockett Island. And we follow one particular character as he returns home after many, many years to find that this sort of isolated Catholic community is in the middle of a sort of a religious revival after the arrival of a new young priest.
So, what are your general thoughts on the show? I got to admit, Tammy and I binged it. We absolutely loved this show.
Yeah, no, I really, really liked it. I'm a big fan of Mike Flanagan's anyway. He's had a long-standing relationship with Netflix. He's made feature films there, Oculus, Hush. He's Gerald's Game, the Stephen King adaptation. He's also done the TV shows The Haunting of Hill House, The Haunting of Bly Manor, and now Midnight Mass. I think his biggest film to date is probably Doctor Sleep, another Stephen King adaptation, the sequel to The Shining. So I was kind of all in even before this got started. You know, I've been a huge fan of his work. He always manages to approach the horror genre from very original, inspiring directions. That his films and stories are always about so many different things. There are themes here as diverse as obviously faith and religion and the influence of organized religion on communities, but also it looks at addiction, particularly alcoholism. We're seeing that this is a subject that's, I think it is kind of personally quite close to his heart, but you're seeing that pop up again and again in his work. It pops up a lot in Stephen King's work as well, so I wonder whether that's something that drew those two creative brains together. But then first and foremost, I mean, this is a horror story. This is a story of vampires in a small town. It's a community. So again, there's another sort of tangible Stephen King link there. It's got similar themes to Salem's Lot, among many others. And I got to be honest, I loved it. I watched it far more slowly than I had planned to, because I watched it with my wife. You know, she's a big horror fan. And I got to be honest, the reason we did that is that she struggled with the pacing of it. And I think that's probably something that we will talk about
Yes.
a bit later on. But I was fully prepared to sit down and do 7 hours on the trot, but she needed a break after one or two episodes each time. Not because of the violence or the gore or the distress that's in the story or any of that, but just because of the pacing. It was a little bit slow for her, I've got to be honest, and she needed a break after every hour, I think.
No, I understand. I think if there's been a critique leveled at this, there is that measure, and I have to admit, the first couple episodes are, if you're going into this, are really just setting the table for what's going to happen. It isn't until about episode 3 that the train goes off the rails and this thing really takes off. But I just wanted to add, when you mentioned Stephen King, one of the best critiques or review lines I heard about this show, and although it's our review that we're focusing on, I just love this line. It said it's the best Stephen King movie that Stephen King didn't do.
Yeah,
And
it's yeah, exactly that. I agree wholeheartedly there.
from the characters to, like you mentioned, the addictions, to that feeling, although it's never specified, I don't think it's ever specified that it's New England. You always get this feeling it's not in Maine, but it's off the coast of Maine somewhere. This is very New England, North Atlantic, Stephen King vibe going here.
Right. Yeah. As soon as I said that, I had a horrible feeling that I might have been wrong, and I thought you, as the American, might jump on me if you're like, "No, of course not. Don't be ridiculous. It's the Upper West Coast." But it's interesting that you qualified that it wasn't specified in the show, because yeah, for me, it really feels like that part of the world, which obviously, yeah, as you mentioned, is Stephen King country, but it's also where Jaws was set. And
Yes.
I saw some, albeit fairly similarities with Steven Spielberg's Jaws,
Mhm.
and this film. It is about a small community, an isolated community, and how, external threats can change it, and how there are, even in the face of great danger, there are differing opinions and differing priorities on what needs to happen for all quote unquote for the good of the community.
And those pressure cooker isolation situations create the best story environment for playing out how people act under pressure. Some people rise to the challenge and they become the heroes. Others, more base nature is revealed, and that's what we kind of see in Midnight Mass. You see the base become baser, the noble become nobler, and then there's a lot of nuance in between.
Well, yeah, and what's fascinating is characters saying one thing and doing another thing. You know, the characters that present themselves as being the noble and the virtuous and the courageous and the pure, in at least one case that I can think of, are the exact opposite of that. And I felt that one of the big themes of the show was about, that sort of the way that it presents one thing, says one thing and does another. Essentially,
right?
Characters do that. I think the show does it. You know, the show doesn't really present itself as a vampire story. I don't think the word vampire is ever mentioned in the entire show.
I think you're right about that. I'd be hard pressed to remember when they actually mention it's a vampire. In fact, if anything, it's the complete irony. They keep referring to it as the angel,
Sure.
and I kept thinking, I don't know where they're getting angel from. That looks like a nasty, demonic-looking vampire to me. But it kind of shows you, though, what religion can do, or really any ideology, is that it forces a certain view through a particular lens. And although we're seeing a reality one way, other people are seeing a reality a completely different way. And we're seeing this played out in the world right now. I mean, one of the arguments in politics, America, UK, is we're not on the same page, the same set of facts. So one person is looking at this angel as a savior, as a sign from God, and others are looking at it as a malevolent force that needs to be destroyed.
Yeah, absolutely, precisely. And I think that really is one of the keys to the story. Is how and everything is validated by, well, it's the scripture, it's in the good book, and therefore it must be obeyed. Almost, it must be respected, it must be followed, it must be obeyed. But just how everybody, whether it's Father Paul, and I suppose we should get to discussing some of the major players involved in the story, who, is quoting verbatim from the scripture and is leading the community down this road to, he calls it, redemption and
right.
And the hereafter. But but we slowly begin to realize that he's actually sort of marching them off a cliff to their own demise. But simultaneously, we see the how, like, Alcoholics Anonymous and how that community, how they use particular passages. What is it? It's called like the Declaration or whatever it's called, which is this sort of chant that they have at the beginning of each meeting,
right?
Recognizing what they can change and what they can't change, and the difference therein, and that's a mantra that is given the reverence almost of Scripture itself.
Yes.
Just how the same piece of text can be twisted and reinterpreted, not misrepresented, I don't think, but just reinterpreted in myriad different ways to suit the personal gain of whomever is in power at the time.
Well, it's interesting. I come from a faith-based aspect, and I'd shared with you that on some of the Facebook groups that I'm part of, some of the private ones where people are processing their faith, particularly people who have been hurt in the church or have had some bad experiences and are trying to reconcile that with their faith. Within those communities, there is a huge love for this miniseries. Like, it is being discussed, it's being talked about. And one of the things that I actually brought up in this group, in one of these groups, is I said, what it really conveyed to me was how Scripture can be used really to justify any action, motive, or agenda. Like, literally anything could be. This show really showed even the most vile actions can be justified with the right use of biblical Scripture. Because I remember at one point, and we'll get into more details in a little bit, but when Father Pruitt finally reveals himself, and there's a big bloody scene, and the church people walk in. I'm thinking, how do you explain this away? I mean, the jig is up now. There's going to be and in a minute, they're able to use scripture to cover this all over, to justify it, to set it up so that they can use it as a power tool to further their religious agenda. And I'm sitting there going, oh my gosh, and I don't want this, and we could edit this out if you're uncomfortable with this aspect, James, but it got me thinking during the Trump campaign, when there was so many times where he did those deal breakers where, oh, surely what he said on this bus or what he did, with this woman or something. And then Christians would come out of the woodwork and tell me scriptures that would justify their continued support. And so I felt like I was watching this whole situation played out on a Netflix drama.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you, and I think that's one of the sort of the great strokes of genius in the piece, is that it's kind of timeless in its setting, whatever, but it has parallels to pretty much anything really.
Yeah.
You can look at this story and go, oh well, this is an allegory for ... And arguably, that's almost the danger of what it is highlighting, is you can take anything and you can twist it to suit your agenda and say, oh well, so this is what Mike Flanagan is actually talking about. It's like, well, maybe, sure, this is what Jesus is saying about this. Well, yeah, sure, maybe, but
Well, I was just going to say, what anybody who's followed a little bit of Mike Flanagan's work, I'm a big fan of The Haunting of Hill House. That's where I got introduced to him. If I'm honest, I'm not a huge horror fan. I enjoy certain aspects of it, but I'm not a horror aficionado. And if I am going to watch horror, it has to really have good story, good character development. It can't be just the random teenage slasher film where people walk into the, oh, we'll go left, we'll go right, and then we know this person's going to get it. I don't really care much for that. In Mike Flanagan, you see something that's much beyond horror. He's into the human story and how do humans interact, and when they're put into situations, will love and redemption and forgiveness win out, or will maliciousness, greed, selfishness and you can see all of these dynamics playing, and even though he seems to obviously take a little bit of a shot at religion, you never get the feeling by the end of this that he's anti-religious. If anything, there's a very pro-faith underpinning I felt to the whole series.
Sure. I mean, it's actually very respectful, I think, towards religion and towards the Catholic Church. It's just wary of the dangers and the vulnerabilities within this kind of house of cards, or this glass house, or whatever you want to refer to it as. But what I liked about it is that the setup almost is sort of pure horror. It's like an isolated community that gets overrun by vampires.
Right.
Is essentially what it's about. But he approaches it in such a way that's almost kind of anti-horror. He's almost starving us of the kills and the thrills and the jump scares that one might expect that a story like that would yield. And instead, he's finding sort of the horror in the mundane. It's just in this slowly encroaching sense of dread and sense of sort of poisoning. The way that characters are slowly sort of shifting over a period of time. I mean, you look at who the protagonists are here, and they're incredibly sort of broken, vulnerable people who need a support network like the local church in order just to get through the day. I mean, you look at our main characters, really, and you've got Riley, played by Zach Gilford, who is our sort of in point into the story. He is a child of this community who moved away to the city, got into finance, and was living the good life until a DUI killed. He basically killed somebody drink driving, and we see that happen, and then he gets a couple of years in prison, and it's about him coming out, and he's been stripped of everything. And so he goes home because it's his only choice, really. And he's kind of welcomed, with open arms by his family. But for him, this is like a last refuge. And he doesn't have a plan. He sort of says, "Oh, I have no place in the world now. I have no purpose. I think he says like I simply exist now."
Right.
And so this is the only place where he can go. And similarly, he meets up with a. So you get the impression that it's kind of like his high school girlfriend who also sort of ran away when she was young, and then she got into an abusive relationship, and then she comes back when she gets pregnant. She runs away from an abusive relationship when she gets pregnant in order to have the baby somewhere safe. But then her mother died, and so she's living in her mother's house and doing her mother's job. She's like the local school teacher, and her mother was the local school teacher before her. And then obviously strange things happen to her. But again, she is a character who has experienced the world. Both of these young characters they've seen the world, and then they've literally been forced back because it's all they have. And what they need is this sense of home, this nest, this sense of community, and then that is ripped out from under them by the chain of events.
Yeah, the show actually starts with the collision that kills the young girl, and Zach Gilford's Riley character on the side of the road being told by a police officer, why is it the bastard drunk is the always one that walks away? And he and the reality is really settling into him that his entire life has changed. But what I thought was interesting was I rewatched the first episode, and it starts, the very first shot is the rear end of his car, and it has one of those Christian fish symbols on there.
Ichthus.
Yeah, Ichthus symbol. And although there's a Catholic, this is an underpin, that's a Catholic church, I come from that evangelical world. And that Ichthus sign, there was so much, take away all the little Catholic trappings. And what I saw through my lens was the evangelical world that I grew up in. So there's kind of this is being set up right from the beginning that we're going to see this as a faith story, a redemption story with vampires thrown in.
It's funny that you mentioned it because I'd actually forgotten that symbol, but I remember we commented on it because it is right. It's like the opening shot. It's the first thing you see, and I remember saying to my wife, "Oh, do you know what that is?" And she didn't know what it was, and I was like, "Oh, I explained to her what it was." And I'm just thinking of this now, but it was a symbol. If I've got this right, it was a symbol used for like one Christian to signify to another Christian that they, in secret at a time when they were sort of outlawed in particular communities. It's like, you're in the club, we're in the club. And I suppose that's some interesting foreshadowing when you've essentially got sort of the opposite of that taking place in the community. You've got a community of Christians, but actually there are some sort of secret members. There's something secretive going on underneath, and the only thing there that is acceptable is that you must be you must be a Christian, and you must be part of the Christian community, even to the point of the one Muslim family who happens to be the sheriff. They're like, oh, but you should still come. They're not really even trying to convert him in a conventional sense or anything like that. I mean, obviously you can't really, but they're like, but you should just come anyway. You should just come anyway. But it's not through a sort of benevolent sense of sort of togetherness.
No,
it's for some wholly sort of more malevolent reasons.
It's interesting you bring up the sheriff too, because there was a moment where I thought, well, that seems a little strange. I mean, I understand looking at through the modern lens, we want to diversify cast. And here you have a largely white, isolated fishing community out in the middle of the sea. And then you have this Muslim Middle Eastern sheriff. And I thought, well, that's a little strange. But then his story about how he actually ended up there gets played out, and it ends up being really powerful. And at first I thought they were just kind of trying to diversify the cast. And sometimes I've been a little critical of shows that will put in minorities or people of varying sexual orientations when it doesn't feel like it's the natural part of the story. It feels like it's a product placement, and you can almost tell by the time. But we're going to look back at a certain time period and go, oh yeah, this is when they used to do that. But his story, when he eventually shares his story about how he ended up in the whole 9/11, how it tags into 9/11, how he really wanted to serve his country, and yet the racism he felt. And I mean, again, it's another communication. There is a measures where this show borders on being too preachy at times, but I can live with that. Maybe it's just my background.
Well, no, let's get into that because I think there's a big part of the show is the preaching
Mm-hmm.
in the show. There are obviously in its most literal form there are these great sermons performed by we haven't even mentioned him yet by
Hamish Linklater.
Hamish Linklater,
Yeah.
who is amazing. For me, is the real standout of the show. He's an actor that I wasn't overly familiar with beforehand, but looking back, I'm like, oh, I've seen about 10 films that he's been in, but he's never really sort of jumped out. But I think one of the most sort of ballsy moves in the show are the number of just long monologues.
Yeah.
Whether they are actual sermons, actual preaching in the church, or just characters telling their story in a way that's almost like a red flag for any sort of studio exec, kind of going, you can't do that. This is not how TV works. You need short scenes, you need quick dialogue. You can't just have soliloquies in the way that you do in sort of Shakespeare or whatever. And yet Flanagan does it again and again and again and again. You have Riley and Erin talking about their
Death.
dreams. Yes, right. Yeah, death. That what happens when you die. They both sit there and tell each other what happens when you die, and they're just these long, slow, introspective, sort of metaphysical sort of speeches that
It's like they're on weed or something, and they're just kind of, what if when you die and you kind of it's that feel.
Yes, but they're incredibly lucid at the same time.
Yeah.
I think all of these speeches are so well written and so focused. They're not like just a rambling, well, I kind of feel like this, or I kind of feel like that, or I think maybe this.
Right.
It's actually a very clearly and eloquently laid out answer to the question. Both of them know the answer to that question when they ask it to each other.
And
their answers are incredibly different.
Yeah, and Riley had kind of lost his faith because of the experience he'd gone through, and then he's trying to come back to some kind of underpinning. He's wanting to experience this faith that Aaron seems to have, which he struggles to have himself. But whether it's those extended monologues or the sheriff doing his or the actual sermons, I give a lot of grace because there is a heck of a lot of redemption in this show. Whether it's Lisa forgiving the alcoholic Joe who shot her accidentally and paralyzed her, and talking about the years that she hated him, but now she forgives him, all the way up to the final scene, which we'll get to, I'm sure, in a few minutes. There is this show oozes redemption. So, and we'll get into this probably in future reviews. I'm a sucker for any movie with redemption in it. It is it gives me all goosebumps. And so I give all kinds of grace, even if they want to have some long soliloquies that I think at times were not particularly great pacing. I'm willing to forgive a little of that.
Sure. I mean, I certainly agree with regards to redemption. I'm a sucker for it. For well-earned catharsis. Whether it's invariably when in films, it's happy stuff that makes me cry rather than sad stuff. If that makes sense. Very rarely will I watch a depressing film and cry at the death of a character. I'm far more likely to cry about the couple getting together at the end, or the childhood dream being realized, or something like that. I'm a complete schmaltzy pushover. That kind of stuff will get me every time.
Same. Tammy, in the early years, she would say, "Are you crying?" And I'd be going, "There's too much goodness in this movie. There's just too much goodness."
Yeah. Okay. Good. Well, I'm glad we're on the same page. I don't think I could quite say that about Midnight Mass. That there's too much goodness in it. People, and I was glad to see that people do get theirs. Yeah. Particularly the characters, but it's done in such a well orchestrated way. There's so much foreshadowing that then comes to bear later on. Riley does he has lost his face and he keeps reminding. I think he writes a note to the priest, doesn't he? He goes, "We are but dust, and to dust we will return." Yeah. And that is literally true of almost every character. By the end, they have turned to dust, and there's a number of moments like that where you're just like, "Oh, this was so well put together. It knows exactly what it's doing. It wasn't sort of dashed off." There's so many films that I watch, and I'm like, did nobody stop and reread this from beginning to end before you started? Because things just don't make sense. Particularly kind of mysteries where the ultimate reveal is, haha, it was Old Man Smithers from the fairground, and you're like, well, that makes no sense because of A, B, and C that happened in the first half of the movie. Whereas here, it's like everything, every little detail, whether it is overindulged early on or not, pays off pitch perfectly later on, and I thought it's brilliantly written.
Couldn't agree more. Things were laid in the first episode or two. I've subsequently, in preparation for this, went back and rewatched the first episode and the last half of the end. And already in the first episode, I was picking up things I missed the first time. It is definitely going to be worth a second complete rewatch.
I think I'm going to do that because I did watch it over the course of about a week. And I would like to just sit down and binge it all, if possible, in a single sitting. Because I think that there are undoubtedly a number of things, particularly in the first couple of episodes, that I've missed. Pay off towards the end.
I totally missed that the mayor was played by Michael Trucco, who played Anders in Battlestar Galactica. I never picked that up until I was prepping for this, and I was really going through the cast list to make sure I understood everything. And I went, oh my gosh, that was him, because I was a big Battlestar Galactica fan. And
I think this is the second time in 2 episodes that you've referenced Battlestar Galactica. Actually,
we'll have to do Battlestar Galactica of the future.
Yeah, and I must confess, I've never seen it. I used to watch the old show,
right,
with Face from
Dirk Benedict,
yeah, but I've never seen the newer one.
Oh, you're killing me here. That's we'll come back to that another time, but
maybe we'll have to do a whole deep dive on that one.
I think since we're talking about cast, though, I think it's worth mentioning that Mike Flanagan really likes to work with a certain group of actors whose faces keep reappearing. It's great to see Henry Thomas from E.T. popping up in his movies. He plays a good character. It's interesting seeing him go from E.T. phone home, the cute little boy, to the older actor who plays the father character.
For sure, yeah, and this one is. I mean, I was gonna mention Henry Thomas for exactly the same reason, and it's great to see that he's managed to have this sort of late career revival, almost solely thanks to Mike Flanagan. I think there's obviously a number of actors who pop up again and again. I mean, not least Kate Siegel, who is Mike Flanagan's wife in real life, and so she's in everything, and she wrote some of his stuff as well with him.
I swear it could be an Angelina Jolie sister. I mean, she feels like Angelina Jolie, but she's not.
They're cut from the same cloth for sure.
Yeah.
But this one was particularly weird because it was like I was seeing a lot of familiar faces, but then they were kind of cast outside of their age range, particularly, right from the start. Where you have in particular Kristen Lehman, who plays Annie Flynn, Riley's mother, but even more so was Alex Esso, who plays the Doctor's mother.
Yes,
and it took me a few episodes to even recognize who it was, because Alex Esso, I think, is about 30, and is playing a character well into her twilight years, and I was like, "What's going on?"
I was fairly tipped off. I could say that by episode 2, where before things were being really revealed, I was noticing that these actors, you can kind of get a feel for when a young actor is playing an older person. And I started thinking something's going to happen that is going to de-age these folk. They've got younger people to pretend to be older so that they can play the younger versions of themselves later in this show. Something's coming. I wasn't sure what it was, but I'm thinking that's a young person with old people's makeup on. Not that it was bad makeup, but It's just the little mannerisms that you pick up that a young person playing an old person would make, but a genuine old person wouldn't.
Yeah, it's like the opposite of what they did in The Irishman, where you've got sort of old Joe Pesci and Robert De Niro walking around, supposed to be like 30 years old, and you're like, yes, but their posture is still that of a 70-year-old.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, the way they're walking, I don't care what you've done to their face. You know, it's kind of the reverse of that. Sure, you know, and you know, I've seen enough movies to kind of know why people do that.
Yeah.
You know, I think the only example I can think of where that never got the payoff that it deserves is in Prometheus, when they get Guy Pearce to play the really 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 old I think he's playing Wayland, and the idea was that there were going to be sort of flashback scenes of him when he's young, and then those scenes all got cut out of the movie.
Yeah.
So you just have Guy Pearce playing this really old bloke for no reason. You're like, that's just odd.
It doesn't work.
So yeah, I mean, I was letting it take me there, but I was like, okay, yes, this is strange. This is obviously sort of for a reason. And obviously Alex Esso has been in she was in Doctor Sleep as Danny's mother.
Oh,
the
okay.
Shelley Duvall character from The Shining. Yeah. In the few sequences that they recreate there.
Oh, good.
But yeah, no, he's sort of assembled this incredibly impressive sort of ensemble of character actors who were just, I think, across the board phenomenal, and that's rare in a TV show like this, where because it's a community, I think they say there's like 125 people in the village, and although you never
129. When I rewatched it, you see the sign at the beginning at population 129. I picked it up on the second view.
And while I don't think we see 129 people, it's a big cast. You know, and it crosses a lot of different demographics and age ranges and what have you. And I think pretty much across the board, you know, you've got the young kids, and even they're, you know, and they're not all that integral to the story, really, apart from, you know, Lisa maybe. But even they, you know, get their moments, and they're done well. There's strong performances, and I was like, okay, this is you know, it's rare when that happens, and it's really good. But I think, you know, we need to talk about Samantha Sloyan as Bev Keane, who is just absolutely monstrous. I think we all know people like her. I think we've all met someone in the community, you know, like that, and you're just like, I see through you. You are just the worst.
And the smugness and the religiosity and the sanctimony, you know, just covering a mound of selfishness and insecurities. And if there's really other than the demonic angel, which we could talk about in a minute if you'd like, other than the actual vampire, there's really only one villain in this show, and it's Bev. She's the real villain. Even Hamish Linklater, Monsignor Pruitt, is a sympathetic character who is redeemed in the end. She's not. She's just bad goods from beginning to end.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was going to say. I mean, yes, he sees the error of his ways, albeit way too late at the end, and realizes, oh, you know, what have I created? I've created a monster out of this community. But even his journey, you get it, even if you don't agree with it. You know, if you consider what Pruitt has been through as a character, you know, and he has gone through this transformation, you know, before he had a chance to choose what the transformation was going to be, and he sees the benefits of it, and the best benefits are, I suppose, from one point of view, justified. You know, they're decent. You know, he has his youth again, he has his life again, and so one can
as someone who's experiencing later age and arthritis in my hips. That's a temptation. That's a real
You know, if you woke up tomorrow morning and you had brand new sort of teenage hips again, I imagine you'd be quite pleased.
Yes. Yeah.
And if and then you discover how you got your new hips, and it involves, you know, I think that here's an interesting question. To what degree do you believe that Father Paul Pruitt, whatever you want to call him, knows that the angel is not an angel, and that it is a force of evil and not something, and that he is doing the wrong thing?
It's interesting. It goes back to, because essentially it's addressing an issue that's affecting the church, the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, and a lot of big evangelical churches, with a lot of sex scandals and abuse stories that are happening. And what happens is you create a narrative in your head, and you, as a group, get a group narrative going, that the good that is happening so outweighs the bad. And we don't specify what the bad is. We'll admit, okay, things aren't always perfect, but in the case of some of these churches, there's always these good things. We're feeding the poor, we're helping people get through, we're putting families back together, we're doing all these good things. We don't want to talk about the lives that are being destroyed in the process. And a lot of these things are coming to life. To answer your question, is I think Pruitt has got, in microcosm, this issue going on in his head. He knows things aren't perfect. He knows there's a reality. He knows that something's wrong, but he's been able to push that to the side because he sees all the good. Look at the young girl gets to walk again. The old lady who is senile, now she's got her faculties again. Relationships are being restored as people are getting younger. All this good is happening. And if we have to break a few eggs to make an omelet, we're going to justify it. The problem is that is a slippery slope that we see, whether in cases in real life or in midnight mass. It ends up to even greater destruction. As soon as you fail to acknowledge reality, it's going to go off the rails at some point.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I think my feeling is that he is aware that something monstrous happened to him. In those catacombs in Damascus or wherever it was.
Israel. Yeah.
But he is also living through the benefits of it.
Yeah.
And I think he is able to find peace in himself to make the decision that the good outweighs the bad.
And James, as we discover later in the show, he had an agenda that we were not privy to most of the show, and that he was in love with the doctor's mother, and the doctor's actually his daughter.
Sure.
And he's trying to get a second chance. And in youth, by making her young again, him young again, that opportunity that we missed, that the regret we have in our life, we don't have to, we can give it a second chance. And he's willing to, and obviously at the end they both realize it was not a good choice.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think he realizes that he has the second chance. Mm-hmm. I think it's important that he doesn't make a choice for himself and for his own plight. It happens to him, and it's how he deals with the aftermath of it happening to him, and then he learns to understand how it came about, and how then he can work it to his benefit and ... the benefit of others.
And he gets kind of played by Bev a lot then too, because he becomes the person on a pedestal that she needs in order to exert power over the town.
Yeah, absolutely, because she can, mastermind her grand scheme of power and dominance, and just saying that she is doing it in his name, and by extension in God's name. I thought what was fascinating are how incrementally these changes come into play in the story, and how the community just kind of accepts it. Beginning with the title of the show, really, the Midnight Masses. Where suddenly it just shifts. It's like, oh no, we're doing all the services at night now.
Yeah.
And they're like, why? So, he's just a bit ill and he needs his rest or something. And it's like, okay. And little elements like that. It's like when they're presented to you as small incremental changes.
Yeah.
It's so terrifying how easily a community can be, turned to a point where they're doing ridiculous and sometimes awful things, and it kind of creeps up on them. I don't think they quite realize where they're being led.
James, just as we begin to wrap things up, moving on from, say, the cast and the actual story, looking at just general tone, cinematography, what was your feeling? Do you think Mike Flanagan captured what he was setting out to do?
Oh, I think so. I think he's got a very distinctive sort of technical virtuosity. Actually, I think he's actually quite a brilliant technical filmmaker that I think is understated and can very easily go unnoticed. I think you saw it a lot in The Haunting of Hill House and in Doctor Sleep, and I think you see it again here. But it can almost go by without being noticed. Is his use particularly of sort of just long, unbroken takes. There's a scene early on, it's either in the first or the second episode, where they wake up the next morning and there are dead cats all over the beach.
Yeah.
That entire sequence is all shot in like a single, roaming take. And you go right from one end of the beach right to the other end of the beach, and you see the entire community sort of moving in and out of shot and all the rest of it. And there are numerous times, particularly, there's a lot of sequences in the church. I think it might even be the Good Friday sermon in particular, which was, I think, or the one where he's calling them to war,
right,
to take arms, where there's such a really sort of smart sort of tech savviness to his filmmaking. There's a lot of sort of almost sort of old school theatrical not trick photography, but that the sets will like move out from behind the camera and so that the camera is free to sort of move without editing and things like that. That I really need to go back and watch it for a second time in order to fully appreciate all of those. But he's incredibly sort of smart and incredibly dexterous and innovative in the way that he makes these films in ways that are, in a way are wholly unnecessary. But it's just that, the beauty of his craft really that really comes through, and I think that helps elevate the material, and it helps create, these extended single takes help sort of create a sense of dread, just the atmosphere, just a sort of pressure cooker style, slow bubbling momentum. I think are really sort of elevated using this kind of technique.
When they have that scene, I think it's in the episode before the end, where the everybody basically turns into a vampire. Like the whole town vamps out in the church. I don't know about you, but I was getting the whole Red Wedding from Game of Thrones thing going on there, and like what Flanagan was doing was almost recreating that crazy red wedding, because there was just blood everywhere, and just coming back to the cinematography, the use of red, the use of blood, it wasn't just a cheap feel like I was getting a special effect. It was a mood. I felt like I was in that church. I felt like how would I react, because of just the angles that he was shooting and the mood from the different there were so many different viewpoints being expressed during that whole. Some people were getting eaten, some people were becoming newly formed vampires and didn't know what to do with it, some were trying to keep the whole thing out and were running away from it, and it was I found it a fascinating and hugely disturbing scene.
Sure, I mean, in a way, that's the scene that the whole show had been building to over sort of 5.5 episodes to, beforehand. And so it was such a sort of cathartic release, albeit one of bloodshed and violence and hysteria. But I think as an audience, we needed that kind of outlet, because we knew it was coming, and we knew that, something bad was happening. But really, until quite late on, you don't get any of that. I mean, you don't. It's not even really acknowledged that, these are vampires and bad stuff is going to go down until quite late into the show. I mean, it's about 2 or 3 episodes before you really have a strong handle on what's even actually happening to the community. And I think it's that moment where you're just like, oh, I needed this. I needed it just to explode in violence, almost just as a release. I couldn't take it any longer.
Well, that we'd opened up the idea of pacing and saying we were going to discuss it later. And I think you're kind of touching on it now, that maybe some of the pacing up until then had been maybe a little slow. And then we finally got a catharsis from it.
I think, I don't want to paint it as a negative. It's a choice, and it's very deliberate, and it's not sluggish or dull or any of those things, but it is certainly measured and considered and, very deliberate in its pacing. And like I said, my wife didn't care for it too much in that regard. But I think it's important in order to illustrate how innocuously these things can infiltrate your daily life. I think if it was, if it suddenly burst through the door and you'd be like, oh, okay, well, I don't have a monster in my community that's going to burst through the door like that. That's fine. But that's not how it gets you. It's just slowly over a period of time you start to realize that, hang on a minute, things aren't happening the way they used to happen. And what is this? Where have we got to here? Just in the way, in our sort of daily routine. And so I think it's a big ask, and it's a long walk, as they say. But I think by the end, it's wholly justified. Those last two episodes, which are pretty much sort of pandemonium. Well, from sort of Riley's, from the attack on Riley onwards. I think that's what the end of episode 4. He walks in and he's like, "Oh, wait, what?"
Yeah.
and he sees the angel, and episode 4 ends, and you're like, well, it's almost like the end of No Time to Die. You're like, hey, wait, hang on, what?
Yeah, that threw me off too, because you basically killed one of the main stars 2/3 of the way into it, and you think that took me completely by surprise. I was not prepared for that. When he takes Ellen out in the rowboat and tells her the whole story, I was wondering if he was then going to kill her. And Mike Flanagan did much, much better. I loved what he did with, I've gone out so far with the sun rising, I can't get back. Basically, I'm going to commit suicide, and I'm going to do it in front of you so that you believe every word that I've just told you.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. It's like, in one regard, it's like the most insensitive thing that he could possibly done. It's like, you have just been through this ordeal of your pregnancy sort of just evaporating on you, and this loss, and we've had this quiet sit down this night together talking about what death means to us, and now I just want to show you one more thing.
I'm
going to kill myself in front of you in the most horrific way possible. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's because that's the only way that you will believe me.
And she does. And she does. And but bringing it kind of into a close, rewatching the end scene, the redemption, I love the juxtaposition of Father Pruitt. So Hamish Linklater as Father Pruitt is with Mildred, and they're holding Annabella Gish, their daughter, and he removes his clerical collar. And there could be that feeling of, okay, this is kind of an anti-religion statement. I'm done with religion. But juxtaposition to that is the entire town knowing they're going to die because there's no place for them to hide now on the island. The sun is rising, and they start all singing "Nearer, My God, to Thee." It's like, we are going to die now, and we realize as a community we've made some really bad decisions, and our last decision is going to be finally a good one. The community comes together, they find faith in their God, and so the message I came away from it is, a lot of times organized religion and structures can create a whole lot of problems, but there is an innocent faith in God, community, family, love, that if we would just focus on that, maybe not some of the other things, we'd all make a lot better decisions all around.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I read the moment where he takes his collar off as him sort of almost acknowledging that he has failed as a priest. Yeah. Not that the church has failed him, but that he has failed the church, or that he has failed God. He is not worthy, if you like, to, and also that that is ultimately what has come between him and happiness with his family, and so he's choosing one rather than the other. But right. I read it as him sort of with a degree of shame, realizing, okay, I've messed this up completely.
Yeah.
And I need to choose in my last moment, and I'm going to choose family. But then and then the community around him chooses faith in like the purest way possible, and you're like, yes, that. I guess the cynic, you could say, well, that's what made them so vulnerable in the beginning, is that at the end of the day they did have this kind of unwavering faith.
Yeah.
But they found it on their own terms, I guess, at the end, rather than being led astray.
Very much so. I think we should end it there, James, unless you have any final thoughts. I think we what would we give out of 5? What do we want to say? How many vials of acidic blood? What?
Vials of combustible blood. I think it's great. I really do. I would urge everybody to see it, whether you're into horror or not, whether you're into religion or not. I think it stands apart from a lot of what's on TV and on Netflix right now. So I'm quite tempted to give it the full 5 vials out of 5. And this conversation has definitely convinced me that I will go back and watch it as soon as possible, because I know that there is a lot more in it than I was able to fully appreciate the first time around.
Yeah. I'm going to give it 4 out of 5 combustible vials. I guess we can give halves if we want, but I'll go 4 out of 5. I think it's solid. It really, I agree with everything you just said. I won't even add to it. If you've enjoyed this review and you haven't seen it already, go watch it. And like James and I think we're going to go back and rewatch it.
Definitely.
Good. All right. Till next week.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Hey, thanks everybody. We'll see you next week on Deep Dive Movie Reviews.